It was a crisp afternoon in Denver, Colorado, the sun casting long, golden rays over the bustling city park. Families strolled along the walking trails. Children's laughter echoed through the air, and the occasional jogger passed by, their rhythmic footsteps adding to the symphony of peaceful sounds. In the midst of the serenity, a young woman sat alone on a bench by the pond, a leather-bound book resting on her lap. Her name was Naomi, a well-known attorney in her mid-30s, respected for her sharp mind and dedication to justice. For once, she had stolen a rare moment of peace, seeking solace in the pages of her book, escaping the endless tide of work that defined her life. Naomi had always believed in the power of quiet moments, in the stillness of nature, but today, that stillness was shattered. The screech of tires broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to see a police cruiser pull up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, their faces stern, their postures rigid with authority. Naomi was the only one sitting alone in the vicinity, and it didn't take long for their eyes to settle on her. One of the officers, a tall man in his 40s, approached her with an air of suspicion, his voice cutting through the air as he asked, "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" Naomi raised an eyebrow, surprised but calm. "Of course," she said, carefully setting her book aside. Her voice was steady, but her mind was already on alert. What could they possibly want with her? As she gathered her thoughts, she had no idea that the encounter she was about to have would spiral into something far beyond what she could have ever imagined. Naomi's heart began to race as the officer's eyes scanned her with a sharpness that felt more invasive than professional. The park, usually a place of tranquility, suddenly felt suffocating. The officer's question hung in the air like a weight she couldn't shake. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" His tone wasn't one of concern. It was accusatory. Naomi blinked, the calmness that had defined her moments before now slipping through her fingers like sand. She set the book down with a quiet thud, raising an eyebrow. "Sitting here reading," she answered, her voice measured and controlled, though she could feel the anger rising in her chest. What was this about? Suspicious activity? Naomi's fingers tightened around the edges of the bench, but she remained still, trying to quell the sense of unease creeping through her. "Can we see some ID?" the second officer asked, his tone sharp and demanding, almost as if he already expected her to be guilty of something. Her pulse quickened, and a slight tremor in her hand betrayed the anxiety she was trying so hard to mask. "Is that really necessary?" Naomi asked, trying to keep her composure intact. Her eyes briefly scanned the small crowd of onlookers now gathering, murmuring among themselves. They too seemed to sense the unease in the air. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he reached toward his belt, his movement deliberate and tense. Naomi's stomach twisted. She could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline, the sensation of being trapped in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of her control. She could feel the eyes of strangers on her, but she chose not to look back. The moment had turned from a simple exchange to something that felt all too wrong. Something wasn't right here. But what could she do? Naomi's mind raced as the officers persisted, their questions becoming more invasive with each passing second. The situation was escalating in a way she couldn't quite comprehend, and her patience was wearing thin. With a forced sigh, she pulled her wallet from her bag and handed over her driver's license, the leather strap of her purse slipping off her shoulder as she did so. The officer took the card with a haughty air, his eyes scanning her personal information with an unnecessary intensity, almost as if he were expecting something incriminating to pop out at him. "Naomi Williams," he read aloud, his voice dripping with disdain. "What's your business here, Miss Williams?" Naomi bit back the sarcastic retort that bubbled up in her throat. Instead, she exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she answered, "I'm here to relax, enjoy the park." "Is that a crime now?" The officer didn't flinch, his face unreadable, while the second officer, who had been standing slightly behind, began to shift his weight from foot to foot as if he was growing impatient. The crowd of onlookers had gotten larger, and their murmurs had turned into full-blown whispers. A few heads turned in Naomi's direction, some with sympathetic looks, others with raised brows, but no one intervened. "Do you always carry a book around with you?" the first officer sneered, eyeing the hardcover she had been reading just moments ago. Naomi's eyebrow twitched in disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" she thought. But she managed to keep the humor in her voice as she responded, "Yes, I'm one of those rare creatures who likes to read books. Sometimes in public, no less." She could feel the tension in the air, and it made her want to laugh. How had a peaceful afternoon at the park turned into this absurd situation? But the officers didn't seem amused. Instead, they just stared at her, waiting for her to say something that would justify their presence, their harsh scrutiny growing with every second. And so Naomi, ever professional, chose to remain silent, her eyes meeting theirs with unwavering defiance. She knew something was wrong, but she was ready for whatever came next. After all, this wasn't the first time she had faced a battle, though it was certainly the strangest. The officer's patience seemed to be wearing thin as he shoved Naomi's ID back into her hand, his face hardening as though he'd been personally insulted by her calm demeanor. Naomi, ever professional, took the card back without a word, her fingers curling around the edges as her mind quickly began to assess the situation. She could feel the weight of the officer's scrutiny, each second dragging out like an eternity. The whispers from the growing crowd were growing louder, and she knew they could all sense the same thing. This wasn't just a routine check. Something was wrong. "You're free to go," the officer said, but there was no sense of finality in his tone. No apology, no recognition of the absurdity of the situation. Instead, he lingered, his eyes narrowing as he shot her one last accusatory look. "But don't leave just yet." Naomi's stomach twisted. She stood up from the bench, her back straight and her posture dignified, despite the cold not forming in her chest. She wasn't breaking any laws. She knew it, but there was an undeniable sense of discomfort, like being caught in an unpredictable storm, its winds picking up faster than she could react. And then, as if the universe had decided to add another twist to this strange afternoon, one of the officers reached out. Naomi flinched, stepping back instinctively, her heart racing. "You're resisting," the officer said flatly, as though repeating a script he had memorized. Her jaw dropped, her breath catching in her throat. "Resisting?" she repeated, incredulous. "I'm sitting on a bench." But the officer's grip tightened. He wasn't listening, wasn't interested in her side of the story. The situation was spiraling out of control. Naomi had always prided herself on her composure, but right now, it was hard to keep calm. With the crowd murmuring in the background and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, the handcuffs clicked shut, their cold metal biting into her wrists like a cruel reminder of the injustice unfolding. She was being arrested. And just like that, the peaceful park, the warm afternoon, and the safety of her routine had all slipped away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of disbelief and a simmering fury. As Naomi was shoved into the back of the police cruiser, her heart was still racing, but it was no longer from fear. It was a kind of simmering frustration that made her want to laugh, though it wasn't the kind of laugh anyone would want to hear. She glanced out the small window of the patrol car, watching the park grow smaller in the distance, its peaceful vibe now a distant memory. The officers had made sure she was tightly cuffed, the metal digging into her skin as though to remind her that this was no longer a simple misunderstanding. This was a power play. Inside the car, the silence was suffocating. Naomi felt the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, but she couldn't let it break her. She had handled the heat of courtroom battles, had gone toe-to-toe with seasoned attorneys and tough defendants, but this was different. This wasn't justice. It was petty, it was wrong, and it was personal. Naomi pressed her lips together, forcing back the wave of bitterness that threatened to spill over. As they arrived at the station, Naomi had to fight the urge to roll her eyes. The booking process was every bit as dehumanizing as she had imagined, a series of mechanical steps designed to strip her of her dignity. Fingerprints, mugshot, the relentless buzz of fluorescent lights overhead, all of it felt like something out of a bad procedural crime drama. She wasn't some common criminal. She was a respected attorney, a citizen with rights. But here she was, caught in a web of systemic injustice, with no way to escape. A young officer with a clipboard walked past her cell a few hours later. "You've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he said in a flat tone, as if he were reading from a script. Naomi shot him a look that could freeze lava. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "You can discuss that in court," he replied, clearly eager to be done with her. Naomi couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. Despite everything, this was just the beginning, and she had no intention of letting it go quietly. Naomi sat in her small, sterile apartment in downtown Denver, surrounded by stacks of legal papers and books, the late evening sunlight filtering through the blinds. She had been working nonstop for hours, paper strewn around her like the remnants of a battlefield, her fingers scribbling notes as her mind raced. The incident at the park was never just about her. It was about everything that had led to this moment, everything that had gone wrong in the system. The officers had underestimated her, thinking she was just another person they could push around. But Naomi was no ordinary person. She was a fighter, a seasoned attorney, and if there was one thing she knew, it was how to turn the tables. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her thoughts clicking into place as she began outlining the civil rights lawsuit. She wasn't just going to sue the officers. She was going to take on the system itself. She could already hear the buzz of the upcoming battle. The press would be relentless. The officers' defense team would throw everything they had at her. But Naomi had something they didn't: the truth. And she was going to use it like a weapon. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was Marissa, her best friend and colleague. Naomi's lips quirked into a small smile before she answered. "You okay?" Marissa's voice was soft, a touch of concern breaking through professional tone that Naomi had come to rely on. Naomi leaned back in her chair, sighing deeply. "I'm fine," she said, though the word tasted bitter on her tongue. "But I'm not letting this slide, Marissa. Not this time." Marissa was silent for a beat, and then Naomi could almost hear her friend's wheels turning on the other end. "I know you. You're already planning your next move." Naomi grinned, her eyes gleaming with a fire of determination. "You know me too well. It's game time." She hung up the phone, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been pushed down by the system, and she wasn't about to let them win. It was a surreal twist of fate that Naomi would find herself sitting at the judge's bench just weeks after the officers who had arrested her. She had spent days preparing her civil rights lawsuit, dissecting every moment of the arrest, every word, every action. She had thought the worst part was over, but the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Naomi's mind raced as she read the notice that had been sent to her. She had been assigned as a judge for a misconduct hearing, a case involving the same two officers. She couldn't believe it at first, almost convinced it was some cruel joke. But no, it was real. She was to preside over the trial of the men who had wrongfully arrested her. The day of the hearing arrived, and Naomi's nerves buzzed under a calm exterior. As she entered the courtroom, her black robe sweeping the floor, she felt a strange mixture of control and disbelief. She glanced over the officers sitting in the defendant's seats, Officer Carter and Officer Daniels, the very men who had pushed her around like she was nothing more than a nuisance. They had no idea what was coming. Naomi's eyes locked with Officer Carter's as she took her seat. His face went pale, his eyes widening in shock. The realization hit him like a freight train. The woman they had humiliated, the woman they had tried to control, was now the one holding the gavel. He leaned over to Daniels, whispering something that Naomi couldn't quite make out. Naomi allowed a moment of stillness to fill the room. She wasn't here for revenge. No, this was something much more profound. This was about power, about justice. She cleared her throat, her voice steady as she said, "This court is now in session." The officers shifted uneasily, and Naomi could feel a discomfort in the air, thick and palpable. This was her moment, not just to judge, but to show them the true meaning of accountability. Naomi's presence in the courtroom was magnetic, her calm authority filling the space as she took her seat on the bench. The officers, Carter and Daniels, sat at the defendant's table, their faces pale and stiff, like two deer caught in headlights. Naomi could practically hear the gears turning in their heads as they processed the reality of the situation. They had arrested her. They had humiliated her. And now, she was the one holding their fates in her hands. It wasn't lost on her that the irony of this moment was as thick as the air in the courtroom. She could almost hear them whispering to each other. trying to figure out how to play the situation, how to escape the looming storm that was Naomi. The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on her, either. The world had a funny way of coming full circle, and here they were, two officers who had misjudged her, now on trial for their own actions. Naomi had always prided herself on her ability to remain impartial, to set aside her personal feelings when it came to justice. But even she had to admit there was a small, satisfying part of her that enjoyed seeing the tables turn. She made sure to maintain her composure, her voice steady as she called the courtroom to order. "We are here today to determine whether the actions of these officers were justified based on the evidence presented," she said, her eyes flickering over to Carter and Daniels. The officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze, but Naomi could see the tension in their bodies. It wasn't just the way of the case. They were uncomfortable, unsettled by the woman they had tried to break, now standing in judgment over them. The trial proceeded with the usual formalities, but for Naomi, this was more than just a courtroom drama. It was a battle, a confrontation between her sense of duty and the wrong that had been done to her, and she would see it through to the end. The trial was a spectacle in itself, but Naomi knew that beneath the surface of this legal battle, there was a much deeper lesson to be learned. The officer's defense attorney had already begun his strategy, painting the situation as a simple misunderstanding, claiming the officers had acted out of instinct in a dangerous situation. But Naomi had been through too many courtroom dramas to fall for such predictable tactics. She had seen this script before, and she wasn't buying it. The officers, once confident in their power, now sat in front of her, their faces stiff, clearly uncomfortable. As the prosecution laid out the case, Naomi's eyes never strayed far from Officer Carter and Officer Daniels. She listened intently to the testimony, but in her mind, she was already connecting the dots. The defense's argument was flimsy, based on the hope that the jury would take the officer's words at face value. But Naomi was no ordinary judge. She knew how to see beyond the surface. She recognized that what the officers were attempting to justify was not an isolated incident, but a reflection of the systemic issues that allowed abuses of power to flourish. Naomi's thoughts weren't just on this case, though. They were on all the people who had been mistreated, misunderstood, or dismissed. She had been there in their shoes, and now she had the chance to stand up for them. As the trial continued, Naomi reminded herself that this wasn't just about holding two officers accountable. It was about setting a precedent, about teaching that justice wasn't always neat or easy, but it was always worth fighting for. She sat back, her expression calm, as the closing statements began. In that moment, Naomi realized that every step of this journey had been a lesson in resilience. She had learned that true strength wasn't just in winning a case. It was in standing firm when the odds seemed insurmountable and never losing sight of what was right. The days following Naomi's trial were filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She had delivered a verdict that would forever be etched into her memory, ordering the officers to undergo extensive retraining and placing a formal disciplinary record that would follow them throughout their careers. But even as she handed down the decision, Naomi knew this was only the beginning. A single ruling wouldn't change a system that had been broken for far too long, but it could spark something, a conversation, a movement, or at least a change in perspective. Naomi stepped out of the courthouse, her black robe now replaced with a dark jacket, and the weight of the gavel still heavy in her mind. A small crowd had gathered outside, and as she made her way through the throngs of reporters and curious onlookers, she was met with quiet nods of approval. A few people stopped her, offering their gratitude for what she had done, but Naomi wasn't interested in the praise. She knew that this moment wasn't about her. It was about the people who had come before her, the countless individuals who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated by a system that claimed to protect them. Later that night, as she sat at her kitchen table, going over legal notes, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that she had done something important, something that went beyond the courtroom. She had stood up to the system, yes, but she had also set an example. She had reminded everyone that justice wasn't just a word. It was an action. It was something you had to fight for, even when it felt like the world was stacked against you. Her phone buzzed again. It was Marissa. "Are you okay?" Marissa asked, knowing the weight of the day. "I'm more than okay," Naomi replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "This is just the start." There's so much more work to be done. And Naomi knew, with unwavering certainty, that she would be the one to do it.